If you ask people what parliaments do, their answer will probably be that parliaments make laws. We think of them as legislative bodies, but for centuries that really wasn't the case. For centuries, parliaments existed primarily to provide a level of financial oversight for the crown. The king didn't just get access to the tax money. The king had to get the parliament to release that tax money. It wasn't until 1414 that the parliament first said that no bill could become a law unless it passed the House of Commons. But for a couple of hundred years after that, it was still quite rare for the parliament to actually pass laws. Until that time, laws as we would understand them developed in a range of ways. Sometimes the laws were just old customs from the Anglo-Saxon days or even earlier. Sometimes the laws were made by the kings. And of course there was the common law, made by building up the precedents established by judges. What we now think of as land law was built up by the king's decrees and by the common law, because control over land in those medieval times was actually the king's source of power. The king gave lands to the nobles in return for taxes and loyalty, and then the nobles gave land to lesser nobles and they gave land to landholding tenants. Land was power. Around the 15th century, a form of land title emerged which they called copyhold. The idea was that when the lord gave land to a tenant for them to occupy for their lives, their title to the land was recorded in writing in the lord's manor or castle, and then they were given a copy of that title. So they were a copyholder. In a way, it was kind of like a modern lease. The only difficulty with copyhold was that the lord could determine or cancel the copyhold anytime they liked. So the copyholder really had no security. Now, I've just said that land was power, and holding land was the same as holding power. The king controlled a lot of the land, but the king didn't control all of it. The church controlled a whole bunch of land in England. And by the time we got to the early 1500s, there was a real power struggle going on between the king, King Henry VIII, and the Pope, Pope Clement VII. Henry VIII famously had 6 wives, trying desperately to have a son in order to keep England from the sort of disastrous civil war that sometimes occurred when the succession of the crown was unclear. The Pope was interfering, forbidding him to divorce and remarry. The Pope even threatened to excommunicate the king, which meant throw him out of the church. That was a big deal in those days, because the church officials in England were almost certainly more loyal to the Pope than to the king. You can see why King Henry VIII might not have been too happy about an alternative power structure owning heaps of land in England. In 1534, he declared that the church in England was no longer going to be part of the Catholic Church, but instead would be the Church of England. A new pope, Pope Paul III, did excommunicate Henry, but he didn't care. He went to war against anyone in the church who was still on the side of the Pope, and as part of this, the Parliament passed a statute which is now known as the Suppression of Religious Houses Act 1535. This act was basically a big old land grab. It took all of the lands other than the largest church estates, and it forfeited those lands to the king. And just to rub it in, the legislation actually said that the lands were being taken away because of the unthrifty, carnal and abominable living of the priests and monks. There was, however, a problem. One reason that land was so important was that land could be worked. It produced crops and meat and timber. And in order to do these things, the land needed tenant farmers. In many cases, the church already had tenant farmers on the land. Usually, those tenant farmers were copyholders, where the church held the original title and the copyholder had their copy. Ideally, King Henry wanted to kick out the church, but leave the tenant farmers in place. The church, however, was pretty clever. They figured out that the king wouldn't want to disturb those copy holdings, and so once they realised this act was on the way, they started granting new leases to people loyal to the church. It was a smart last-ditch attempt by the church to retain control over those lands. When they realised what was going on, the Parliament acted. The final version of the statute included the following two clauses. Now, I'm going to put on screen an early text, but it's written in medieval English. Translated into modern English, there was a clause which said, "Such persons as have leases for time of life or years, whereupon is reserved the old rent, shall have and enjoy their said leases as if this act had never been made." However, there was also a clause that said, "Crafty and fraudulent grants and leases made by any of the said chief governors of such religious houses, within 1 year next afore the making of this act, shall be utterly void and of no effect." In Heydon's case, there was a church manor called Ottery in County Devon, which had various lands attached to it. Those lands had been granted to a man named Ware and to his son for their lives by copyhold. So they were copyholders who would hold their title for their lives unless the church took away their copyhold. In this case, that's exactly what the church did. While being crafty and fraudulent, the church took the lands off Ware and gave them to Heydon on an 80-year lease. Now, it was a pretty easy matter for the court to work out what to do about Heydon. It was a lease made within a year before the Suppression of Religious Houses Act was passed, and so the lease to Heydon was void. The question was, though, whether Ware should have his lease back. Let's look at that clause again. It says, "Such persons as have leases for time of life or years, whereupon is reserved the old rent, shall have and enjoy their said leases as if this act had never been made." So, did Ware have a lease for his life? The copyhold said for life, but is it really for life if the Lord can take it away? And was it really for life in this situation where it actually had been taken away? The answer just simply wasn't in the legislation, but the court had to make a decision about whether the words leases for time of life or years should include copyhold. The courts at this time were still not used to dealing with legislation. They were used to making common law. There were very few rules for how courts would read and apply legislation, especially in situations like this where the legislation seemed unclear. Sir Roger Manwood, the Chief Baron of the Exchequer, established 4 rules for how they would handle these situations. They were reported in the English reports by Sir Edward Coke, the most famous legal writer of the 16th century. Coke reported that Manwood's 4 rules went like this. Where the statute was unclear, they must first consider what was the common law prior to the making of the legislation. Second, they must ask what was the defect or mischief for which the common law did not provide. In other words, it was assumed that the Parliament would only step in if the Parliament felt that the common law was inadequate in a particular way. So the court should try and identify whatever it was that the Parliament was trying to fix. Third, they must consider what remedy the Parliament hath resolved and appointed to cure the disease. So read the actual words of the statute. And finally, the court had to interpret the legislation in a way that would suppress the mischief and advance the remedy, and suppress subtle inventions and evasions for continuance of the mischief, and to add force and life to the cure and remedy according to the true intent of the makers of the Act. These 4 steps became known as the Mischief Rule. Work out what mischief or defect the Parliament was trying to fix and help the Parliament's intentions along. So on that basis, the court found that the Parliament's intention was that the traditional tenets of the church land should not be disturbed by this new legislation. Mr. Ware had only been disturbed because of the crafty actions of the church, and so the intention of the Parliament was best supported by giving the Wares back their copyhold. The Mischief Rule has its modern form in the modern purposive approach to statutory interpretation. We no longer assume that the Parliament only acts to fix defects or mischiefs in the common law, but we do still assume that the Parliament has a purpose when it passes legislation, and the court should support that purpose. This case is where that all began.